Hello and welcome to the Daily Item and our ongoing series of conversations with candidates for public office. Our guest today is Jennifer Rager-Kay, who is running against Fred Keller in the 85th State House District. And we'll be chatting with Dr. Rager-Kay, and hopefully in the not too distant future we'll also have Fred Keller here answering the same kinds of questions. So let's move on to education. One of the things I've heard you talk about, I think even when we had you in here for the primary conversation, was free college tuition. So let's talk about that and how you feel that would come about, how it could be paid for, and whatnot.
Sure. Yeah. Free is a dangerous word. Fully funded sounds a little bit better because it's not like we're giving people free rides without having them have to do some work themselves. The issue I think that prevents a lot of people, especially in this area, from advancing is the threat of debt, college debt. It's something that unfortunately should not be a deterrent, but is. As far as funding goes, one thing that has been proposed by the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, which is a nonpartisan organization, business in Harrisburg, is something called the Pennsylvania Promise, which has to do with fully funded public educations, depending on how many years. It's not going to be like, here's a free check, you can go as long as you want. But it also funds trade schools and alternative schools, for sometimes college isn't for everyone. But funding for that would primarily come from three different sources. The first is, all three of them have to do with finding sources of recurring revenue, not just something that will pass the budget good enough for 1 year. The first one is the severance tax, which is something that's been kicked around for years and years and years. And I had a member at one of the council meetings I attended say, why haven't we decided on anything? And I said, of course, that's a good question. We have an impact fee that the other side, brings up that has brought in some money. However, it's a diminishing fee, so it's not going to last forever. And the fact that when you trace kind of the steps back, and you can't help but see that the oil industry and the gas industry has spent over $60 million in political action funding for the other side. So a severance tax, a lot of the negativity that you hear about it is, well, it's going to get passed down to the people, except the fact that 80% of what is collected in the state of Pennsylvania from those companies is shipped out of state. And if you look at your gas bill, unfortunately, you're paying a severance tax to New Jersey and New York. The impact fee, since its installation in 2012, has brought about $200 billion. If that would be the case for a severance tax, it would be over $400 billion. So while it is a lot of money, $200 billion, we could have doubled that. Then the issue becomes, you hear a lot of negativity about the fact that, well, all that money is going to go in the general fund. It's not going to come back to small communities like ours because of Act 13. However, whenever you enact a severance tax, you just put that in the stipulation that not all of it's going towards the general fund. Another source that is one that really, an issue that really bothers me is the issue with corporate taxes in the state of Pennsylvania. There's about 74% of the corporate businesses, we're not talking about small businesses or, the mom and pop shops. 74% of corporations in the state of Pennsylvania don't pay their corporate taxes. And so that's another $3 or $4 billion a year that we're losing.
I'm sorry, what was it? Repeat that number?
74% of corporations in the state of Pennsylvania do not pay corporate taxes because of something called the Delaware loophole.
Okay.
And what that is Walmart, for example, multiple states that it covers. Thanks to the Delaware loophole, Walmart can choose what state it reports its profits in. You don't report any profits in the state of Pennsylvania, you don't pay any corporate taxes, even though you're reaping the benefits of being in the state of Pennsylvania.
I've actually never heard of that. Can we just Google that, or just?
Yeah, Delaware loophole.
Delaware loophole. Okay.
Yep. And so, again, all of these things, especially as a, uneducated citizen, not knowing anything about this when I first started, none of it made sense to me because it's common sense, right? Well, why aren't we making these corporations pay money? Once again, you follow the trail back and find out that Unfortunately, because there isn't any restriction with how money can be given to politicians during campaign season, unfortunately, that's kind of where a lot of that comes from.
Okay, and you said there were 3 sources. What would be the third one?
The other one is issues with our income tax system. Right now, the state of Pennsylvania has a flat tax. It's in the Pennsylvania Constitution. No matter if you make $20,000 a year, $20 million a year, you pay the same percent in income tax. Sounds fair, sounds wonderful, until you break it down and you look at the fact that actually the top 1% are paying less of their net worth than the bottom 20%. So someone who makes $20,000 a year is actually paying about 12% of their net worth in taxes, where somebody who makes over $1.7 million a year is actually paying only about 2 to 3% of their net worth.
Okay.
So once again, it's hardworking families that suffer.
Now, speaking of taxes, the Republican candidate for governor, Scott Wagner, is out there with a promise to end the school portion of property taxes if he's elected governor. Where do you stand on property tax reform?
I would love to ask him how first, but also property tax reform is very important. First of all, it shouldn't be the sole source of income of revenue for public education. Property taxes tend to hurt areas where there are more renters than there are owners. And I don't think our school kids should suffer just because their parents aren't able to own a property, when an area like Sunbury, for example, we have more renters here. So less revenue from property taxes, the school system suffers. You go somewhere like Lewisburg, more owners, higher revenue because more property taxes coming in, their school system benefits from that. So I certainly think that system needs to be overhauled. And again, if we increase these sources for recurring revenue, all of these problems, education, property taxes, the pension crisis, everything could be taken care of so much easier.
Okay, so there is a Senate bill out there that I know Scott Wagner was part of bringing about, and it would, in his conversation with us, he explained to us that it would increase, I guess, the sales tax.
It would.
And the income tax.
But once again, if you increase the sales tax, you look at what population that would affect. And unfortunately, it's the middle and lower income class. We're the ones that are out there buying TVs, buying necessities and clothing. When you increase sales tax, you're increasing a burden on the people that are the ones that actually go out there and purchase products. And when you look at, again, that $1 million income range, those aren't the people that are going out there buying the clothes, buying the cars, buying the TVs.
Why? Don't those people buy those same things?
They do, but they tend to save. You look at the top 1%, they're more of the saving investment category. When you look at the bottom 20 or 30% of income earners, they're the ones that stimulate the economy the most because they're putting back. And that's the whole idea with raising the minimum wage. Everybody's in an uproar about, well, costs, the grocery store costs are going to go up, clothing costs are going to go up. Yes, but it all stimulates. It's priming the pump. You give the people who spend the most a little bit more to spend, they're going to spend it, regardless of, the costs that go up. And everybody benefits from that. Not only
so you do approve of raising the minimum wage?
Absolutely.
And to what?
I certainly think it's not unheard of to go to $12 at first, with the idea of potentially, and I favor what the governor has stated by 2020 getting up to $15. When you look at all the states around us, you have to wonder, it's not a wonder of why we're suffering. We're the only state in the area that hasn't raised its minimum wages in years.
That's absolutely true. Rick?
Okay, let's jump to some things that your opponent has talked about.
Sure.
I think one of the things that was implied at your recent debate was that it's a full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
You have a full-time job as a med.
Absolutely.
You're a wife. You're a mother. You have church functions.
Mm-hmm.
And so your opponent said it's a 6-day-a-week job.
Right.
what's your response to, can you do it all?
Yeah, I think it's a 7-day-a-week job. And I certainly think that the more involved, it's more of an asset actually for the job. You know, I kind of mentioned briefly in the debate the issue of complacency. And when you are a career politician, you've been there so long that you kind of sit back and rest on the fact that statistically you're going to get elected again based on the area, and you don't have to do your work because you know you're going to get there. You give somebody more jobs, more responsibility, they're going to work harder. And that's the same way with me. I look at the fact that I'm a mother, I am a wife, I'm a physician, I'm involved in my church as an asset to the position, primarily because I care for a living. I listen for a living. That's my profession. Availability. I've been available 24/7 for the last 5 years while I've been here. So none of that is out of the question. The other bonus is that I already care for a lot of my constituents. Caring for them in the office is certainly a bonus because the next step is just an extension to Harrisburg.
I want to sort of build on that one with the full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
Your opponent supports a reduction in the state legislature,
Mm-hmm.
Both in the House and the Senate. Your thoughts on that?
I do not. It's certainly a question that you have to look at from both sides. Again, that's an easy answer to say to everything. You have to look at both sides. But one thing I've noticed in this area is even though in our district, we're one of the smaller districts, we have 27 municipalities, it hasn't been represented well over the last 8 years, let alone over the last 10 or 12. When you certainly, one of the opportunities I've had was to visit, I visited 25 now of the 27, have 2 to go. But several of them say that they couldn't tell you the last time a representative had visited their area and asked them what they needed. And so when you have these small areas that already don't have representation, when you increase that for a representative to cover more municipalities, I think you're taking away already care that is not given to rural areas.
On the other hand, though, we are looking at I think the second highest paid legislature in the country.
We are.
Feels like sometimes we're not getting the bang for our buck.
I agree, but I don't think that decreasing the number is the answer. I think electing people that better represent the position is the answer.
And you think, a lot of our states across the country don't have full-time legislatures.
Correct. Pennsylvania is considered a full-time legislation. However, when I first began this idea or even thought process, the first place I called was Harrisburg to see if this is even reasonable, to have a profession and also still be a representative. And I wouldn't be the only one. However, if I was any farther away than I am in Selinsgrove, traveling wouldn't be very feasible. And then discussing the question of full-time legislature, the Pennsylvania legislation meets routinely. However, when they're in session Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, 2 weeks out of the month. And it's not to say that that's an easy job because, again, there's going to be lots of times of traveling back and forth for special meetings and committee meetings. But it's certainly not something that requires me to be in an office in Harrisburg 9 to 5 every day. The availability, that's something different. And again, that's not something that I'm not used to.
Okay. Bill or Brett?
Yeah, obviously it appears you currently have a good job.
Correct.
And was there one thing that made your decision that made you want to run for the 85th district?
Yeah.
And maybe you could tell our readers how you would be an improvement over Fred, who's been in office now for several years.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. The biggest driving force is my son. I certainly think over the last 2 years, I haven't been happy with the way that politically our country is going, but morally as well. And when I look at him, I see myself as a 5-year-old growing up in rural Pennsylvania where I couldn't even tell you I knew the difference between a Republican and a Democrat at that age at all, let alone the fact of knowing that we're different. We're different because of where we were born, who our mothers, fathers, whether we have one mother, one father, 2 mothers, 2 fathers. I didn't know any of that. I was just a kid who, enjoyed playing and caring, and I knew that if I needed something, my neighbors would help us out, and vice versa. So when I looked at my son, knowing that things are going to be drastically different for him, I wanted to be able to make a change. Certainly don't pretend to be Wonder Woman to make things change overnight, but if I wanted to play my part and truly make the world or this area a better place for him, electorally was really the only way to go. And as far as benefits for me being in office as opposed to my opponent, I think a lot. You know, again, as I said, Fred is a nice person. I've spoke with him quite a bit. Inexperienced, 8 years, knows the ins and outs. It takes a lot more than being a nice person and having experience to be a successful representative. That's the difference. It's great that you can feel like you can talk to him and that he's available. But again, results aren't there. And, we have 2 huge universities in our district, but we don't have any type of, our economic issues have not improved. People come into our areas, they go to the universities, and then they leave because there's nothing there for them to stay at. And I certainly think there's a lot of room for improvement in our area, and I have a lot of great ideas. One of the other aspects that I think I have that my opponent isn't able to have is the understanding the importance of health care and other crises like the opioid crisis, the mental health crisis, substance abuse. I have a unique aspect because I can be in subcommittees and committees from this aspect as a physician that my opponent isn't able to. So I think I bring a lot of diversity to that. And again, as a physician, I took an oath to take care of people, not political party, not whoever gives me the most money, what corporation is funding me or supporting me. None of that matters to me as a physician, and none of that's going to matter as a representative in Harrisburg.
Okay, you made a great transition to your career as a doctor, so I have a question for you on the opioid
Sure.
situation. As a doctor, do you think hospitals are doing enough to educate doctors to the dangers of overprescribing opioids?
Too little, too late. Unfortunately, I will be the first to admit as a physician that the physicians, our community, are one of the prime people to blame for the opioid crisis. And it's not because we wanted to get people addicted. It's because as a community and as a profession, we have been forced, or trained, I should say, to make sure that pain is the 5th vital sign. What that means is you have blood pressure, heart rate, respiration rate, and oxygen status, but then we add in pain. So every patient that comes into the hospital, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad do you hurt? And unfortunately, patients don't always scale that properly or know what a true 10 is. But we're trained to do whatever's possible to make sure that that patient is as in least pain as possible. However, over the years, that's come back to bite us, primarily because when we're pushing all of these narcotics to help people be quote-unquote pain-free, it changes the person's brain, basically, in a nutshell. Any narcotic that is used more than 3 days, narcotic meaning Percocet, Vicodin, morphine, any that's used more than 3 days starts to change the neurotransmitters in the brain. It becomes a chemical dependency. So it's not just, oh, it feels good, my pain's free, I'm going to take it again. If you don't take it, then your body suffers from it. So then you want to use more. And then when the drugs run out and you don't have any other drugs and your doctor's not going to give you any more because they think you've had enough, the next best thing, unfortunately, is heroin. It's cheaper and more available, unfortunately. So then it becomes like this cascade of, slippery slope. But thankfully, our medical community is starting to make changes. In Pennsylvania, there's the Physician Drug Monitoring Program, which I think is phenomenal because it turns the accountability back to the physicians, which it should be. Just today, I put a prescription in for a narcotic for a patient that I operated on yesterday. I have to check within that system to see what medications the patient's been on. Has she been prescribed any other narcotics, any other controlled substances? and then I'm allowed to put it in. Even if she has, I'm still allowed to put it in, but the accountability comes back on me.
So you're required to do that, or is that something you self-report?
That's a state requirement.
Okay. So has that changed your approach to prescribing?
Thankfully, in my profession, even as a surgical subspecialist, I've always been keenly aware of what I'm
And
prescribing.
Just to be clear, ear, nose, and throat is your specialty?
Correct.
Okay.
Even in my profession where I do prescribe narcotics, it's certainly on a lower scale than even primary care. So I'm seeing less patients that need it than they are. So it's something that, I've certainly been aware of. But I can tell you as a resident, before I realized this opioid crisis was coming about, it was standard. We knew we wrote a prescription for every patient after a surgery, same amount, same number of pills. We weren't taking into consideration, did that patient just receive a prescription last week for the same medicine? And frankly, there was no way to look.
Okay. So obviously, in addition to all this, there's the response by the state government in dealing with the opioid heroin crisis. What have been the missing links? Because I feel like right now, and I've heard Joanne Troutman, who's a member of our community advisory board and CEO of the United Way, talk about that we're not making as much progress as she'd like.
I agree.
What's missing? What do we have to do?
Funding, first of all, is the major source. It was briefly brought up at the debate the other night about the fact that the original Republican spending plan that they put forth before the budget was passed actually made a huge cut in the funding for substance abuse and mental health programs. Now, thankfully, the budget that was passed does show an increase from last year, but it doesn't go without saying that there are parties in the legislature that want to take funding from one source to put it to another, but you're not going to, it's like robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's not going to make anything better. There needs to be guaranteed funding, more funding for these services, rather than just saying, he's a drug dealer, he's a drug addict, lock him up in jail and hope for the best. That's not the answer.
Okay, so what about accountability, though, holding those responsible for spurring the epidemic?
As far as holding physicians responsible, holding...
Anybody, dealers, pharmaceutical companies, what have you?
Yeah, pharmaceutical companies. That's a whole another hour that we could talk about that. And, big pharma, certainly, they have quite a hold on a lot of people that make decisions in our legislation and in our Congress. Unfortunately, I certainly think that whole system of funding and political donations needs to be overhauled tremendously. As a physician, I chose to work for a hospital so that I didn't have the opportunity to even consider anything that would make me biased towards a medication or surgery or any other decision to take care of my patients. Unfortunately, that's not the case everywhere. And lawmakers are not immune to that either.
One of the issues that comes up a lot in this conversation is mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And, we find our police authorities forced to deal with people for whom they're not really trained.
Correct.
When you talked about a need for increased funding, where do we need to go in Pennsylvania with developing more resources for treating mental health issues?
We have a huge lack of mental health facilities to begin with. So certainly when somebody is waiting to get treatment, there have been patients that sit in the emergency room for days waiting to get placement somewhere. So availability is the first problem. The second is the funding to keep them there. You have people that are asking for help, lots of people who don't, but you have people who are asking for help, whether it's with substance abuse or mental health, that get placed somewhere, and then 5 days later they're told, sorry, your insurance doesn't cover you any longer. We have to send you home. And I've seen that happen personally. My husband and I both have had friends and acquaintances who have had that happen to, and several weren't very fortunate because, they either end up taking their own life or they overdose. So you have these people who are asking for help. A, we don't have availability, a bed for them, and B, they don't have the funding to get the help they need.
If I may, it's called a crisis. I think everybody will agree that it is a crisis, and the politicians also agree that something needs to be done.
Right.
And it seems like we're wasting valuable time with this, trying to decide what we want to do. As a physician, how long, if you were part of a plan to try to cure this, how long do you think something like that would take before we see results?
I would say at least, before you start seeing a decrease in overdoses and deaths related to that, it's probably going to be a 2 to 3 year type period. And I only estimate that because of the physician drug monitoring program. Unfortunately, the state doesn't have anything in place to be prepared for the consequences of the physician drug monitoring program. And I say consequences because I spoke highly of it, which it is a good program, but the consequence of it is going to be an increase in heroin overdoses, because as a physician, if I'm cutting somebody off and saying, oh, sorry, you're not going to get the pills because I see you just got another prescription a week ago, we're being more responsible, more accountable, but it doesn't give any solution to that patient that's already dependent on that narcotic. And the next way that they're going to get it, if they can't get it from a medical professional, is illegally. And the cheapest, unfortunately, is heroin. It's cheaper than narcotics that are on the street. So we're going to see, we've actually already seen, since its implementation about 2 years ago, the state of Pennsylvania has already seen an increase in overdoses. And there hasn't been anything right now put in place. So it is a sense of urgency to figure out what is an alternative, how can we do to help these patients, because unfortunately it's going to continue to rise until, in a very sad way of looking at it, all of the patients that are hooked on heroin either find the rare help that they need or overdose themselves.
Okay, one of the big topics that we hear about, and I kind of imagine you may hear about it when you're traveling around the area, is the lack of affordable child care.
Yeah.
In fact, we're doing a big project on that that'll be published in our pages somewhere in December. How serious the problem is that, how much you're hearing about it, and what can be done about it. Somebody told me the other day, I was at an early childhood learning conference, and they were talking about the fact that there wasn't a daycare provider in this area that doesn't have a wait list.
Yeah.
So there's a real urgent need, it would seem.
There
but
is.
I don't. Is there an urgent response that we can do to help that problem?
Yeah, so it's certainly, having credible sources of childcare is very important. Even myself, and my husband, when we moved to this area, we were kind of given the heads up a few weeks, about a month or so before we actually moved, to say, hey, get on the wait list somewhere, call somewhere to get on. And we still had problems when we actually moved here to have to wait a little while. So you have all these hindrances to people who want to work. They want to go out, make a living, work hard for their family, but we don't have the facilities available for them to have proper child care, let alone affordable child care. One of the big things that, that it's easy for people to stereotype is that people are lazy and they don't want to work. Well, when it's cheaper to stay home, when it's more economic for them to stay home and watch their own children than to put their children in daycare that costs more than what they're making, you do the math. And it's not that they're being lazy, it's just they can't afford to work, which is an oxymoron to even say that. So, as far as a solution to that problem, I don't have an absolute one. I just know that, we need to find a way to increase very credible sources of childcare for the area without making it impossible for people to work and afford childcare.
Okay. Rick?
Something that just me that are like dinner table issues. Now you're out there, you've gone through a lot of homes, walked into homes.
Yeah.
What really are the most important issues to your constituents, and how can you do something maybe different than how your opponent has been doing?
I think Sure. A lot of the issues are around jobs. That's probably And that's the biggest one. Jobs that are going to last, jobs that provide benefits, jobs that come with security. In this area, I think we haven't seen that over the last several years. We haven't seen the increase in job availability or jobs that last. When we have companies, the bridges, that are being built and the bypass, that's phenomenal. But it's not going to last forever. That job's going to be done, and that group are going to leave the area and take their people with them. So I certainly think jobs the biggest one that I see, when I speak with people, when you go to Harrisburg, how about this, this, and this? Property taxes is also a big one. We have older patients with fixed incomes that are barely making ends meet to begin with. And then there's, higher property taxes in the area, and they're suffering from that.
We have a large senior population.
We do.
The main concern
is healthcare and property taxes from the older patient or older constituents that I've spoke with is their biggest issue. Affording their medications and paying their taxes. That's the two burdens that they see, that I see in the office as well. I don't see the issue of property taxes come up, but I have patients that have to choose between affording a certain medication and paying a certain bill every month because they're on a fixed income.
So if you were in Harrisburg, what could you do? There are certain committees that might be able to get on.
Yeah, yes, again, one of the biggest ones I think that I have the opportunity to make the biggest improvement is the healthcare issue. And everybody gasps when I say healthcare for all, because, then the question becomes, you would think that the question of cost comes first, but unfortunately in this area, the question of who deserves it and who doesn't comes first, which is, it's very disheartening that we have people in this area that think that just because somebody looks different than them, that they don't deserve the same coverage that they deserve. Nobody knows each person's story to understand why they don't work, why they're disabled. There's going to be people that take advantage of every public program out there. We can't prevent that. But certainly, being able to have the basic necessities, I think is something that we all deserve.
One of the issues that always comes up around here as well is gun rights. Now, recently, both houses and the governor, they passed a law that will make it quicker for people to turn over weapons when they've been convicted of abuse or
Correct.
when they have been made the topic of a protection from abuse order.
Correct.
A, did you agree with that? And B, what other, if any, reasonable gun issues do you think the legislature should address in Pennsylvania?
I absolutely agree with the domestic violence bill that was just passed. Absolutely. I'm a supporter of the Moms Demand Action group. I'm endorsed by them because I agree with responsible gun ownership. I'm very much pro Second Amendment. I don't want anybody taking my gun or my right to own my gun away from me. But the issue is you have to go farther than that. One thing that the state of Pennsylvania has that I think is extremely important to overhaul and change is the lack of background checks they have on the exchange of long guns. So it's great that now we prevent domestic violence abusers from, having handguns, but nothing prevents that person from going out to a flea market tomorrow and purchasing a long gun because there's no accountability and no background check. The seller doesn't even have to ask the person for their name. They give them cash, they get a long gun, and that's it. So certainly, when it comes to gun law reform, I certainly think that that's one that it just makes sense. I have no problem waiting for a background check for any gun that I want to own. And it certainly needs to be consistent across the board.
What do you think about reciprocal gun laws across state borders?
Yeah, that's a good question. It certainly varies. If you go north, if you go south, west, or east of here, it's all different. And again, I don't think the issue necessarily is whether you have a gun or necessarily even what type of gun. It's just helping to ensure that gun does not get into the hands of somebody that can be tremendously dangerous with that.
Okay, but if you're driving from Pennsylvania to New York and the gun laws are considerably different,
Yeah.
do you think what you're legally allowed to do in Pennsylvania should carry over while you're staying in New York?
Well, you're traveling to a different, municipality, a different state that has its own laws that you have to abide by. The same people that have a problem with that are the ones that, the same people that say you should be able to drive anywhere with your gun are the same people that, have a problem with immigration issues that, people coming into our country and not obeying our laws. So why is there a different? You're going to a different state, you just need to follow their rules as well.
Okay. One other quick topic I'd like to address, and then we'll see if anybody else has a question, is transportation. And I don't know if that comes up in any of your conversations with the people around the area, but I know there's a potential now for a pilot program to establish a public transportation route on the 1115
There
corridor.
is.
How viable do you think that idea is, and do you support that idea?
Yeah, I don't really haven't ran into it much campaigning as much as I have in my office. I have patients that I need to refer for different tests to different other specialists who have no transportation. That's something that's huge in this area. We have an older population, and we also have a population of people that have no transportation availability. So we have, rapid transit, which is phenomenal, but it doesn't go up that 1115 corridor. And I was actually invited to discuss that issue with the proposal for having that, and I think it's a wonderful idea. Again, the people who are against that, the first thing that comes up is cost. Everything costs money. However, it's not that it's not going to be beneficial to the people in this area. If they can get back and forth, they can get back and forth to work. So if you're able to increase the opportunity for people to get to employment, which we tremendously lack in this area, they're going to need to travel somewhere to work, then it's a benefit for everyone.
Okay. Anybody else?
I'd like to piggyback off that one. When you get to Harrisburg, you're a representative from a fairly rural part of the state. How do you sell people from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh on things like transportation and things like childcare? How do you get the funding here as opposed to sending it where there's a larger population?
Yeah, I kind of jokingly made the comment at the debate that some people in Harrisburg, a lot of people in Harrisburg may not be really happy when I get there, because I'm certainly not afraid to stand up for what I think that the people in my area need. I look at people in this area as family because they remind me of where I grew up. So certainly I don't have any problem with standing up for what is necessary, and also introducing legislation that I think is going to help this area. The other thing is, talking to some of the people that are already representatives and senators in those areas, I don't think it's that they're against giving us any type of funding. It's just unfortunate that most of the funding in the state tends to go to those two areas because their representatives are able to show a need for it, and our representative hasn't been able to do that.
Okay. I guess to wrap up, you're obviously campaigning in an area that has gone heavily Republican in any recent election in anybody here's memory.
Yeah.
So how do you feel like you've been able to make inroads in that? And what are you trying to do? You've got 3-4 weeks left to go. What are you going to do to try to just really bring it home?
I think our strategy as far as trying to reach as many voters as possible that could be potential swing voters. A big problem in this area is that even Democratic voters haven't had a reason or someone to vote for. Our representative, other than a writing candidate, ran uncontested in 2016. there was really no reason for Democrats to come out and vote for a representative that they felt that they wanted. So giving the people an opportunity to have a choice is the first step. You know, there's 8,900 registered Democrats in the district. Over 1,700 of them haven't voted in any of the last 4 elections. You know, so that's huge. Unfortunately, even more, only 1,700 of them have voted in every election. So you have this huge range of 5,000 Democrats who sporadically vote, and again, they haven't really had anyone to vote for. So certainly targeting those voters are the first step. But we also have a lot of people that I think, regardless of what party they belong to, they're just tired of not seeing any progress in the area. And hopefully I'm showing them that I'm a fresh face, fresh ideas, and willing to listen. And not afraid to cross party lines, not afraid to even put my own values aside to listen to what's necessary for this area.
Okay. Well, Dr. Rager-Kay, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We will be back with further interviews with further candidates for office in the coming days and weeks.